Hello, you're watching Dialogue coming to you live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm Tian Wei. The United States and the EU are beginning to work on one of the world's biggest free trade agreements, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. Meanwhile, the United States and China are using different accounting methods to figure out which country deserves the title of the world's biggest trading nation by volume. In addition, an increasing number of regional free trade agreements and bilateral trade deals are under negotiation or have already been reached. So how to understand the dramatic changes going on in international trade with the rise of emerging economies? With the current international trade system, will it last despite of the Doha round of trade talks being bogged down and falling public confidence? Joining us to answer all of these questions and predicting the future of global trade system, I'm joined here in the studio by Mr. Wang Jingzhen, who is the Vice Chairman of the China Council for Promotion for International Trade. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
And also we're joined in the studio by Professor Liu Baocheng from the University of International Business and Economics. Welcome as well. Later we're going to also talk to some of the European experts on the issue. But before we go to a discussion with both of you and many others, let's take a look at this background report.
The European Union and the United States have agreed to pursue talks aimed at achieving an overarching transatlantic free trade deal. The deal to form the world's biggest free trade alliance would promote trade between economies that account for half the world's economy and 1/3 of its trade. The 27-member EU said this would be the biggest bilateral trade agreement ever negotiated.
A future deal between the world's two most important economic powers will be a game changer. Together, we will form the largest free trade zone in the world.
President Barack Obama threw his weight behind this in his State of the Union address.
And tonight I'm announcing that we will launch talks on a comprehensive transatlantic trade and investment partnership with the European Union, because trade that is fair and free across the Atlantic supports millions of good-paying American jobs.
The report estimates a deal would boost Europe's economy by around 0.5%, or $116 billion, and America's by 0.4%, or nearly $90 billion in just over a decade. The US and Europe's motives for pursuing the Transatlantic Strategic Economic Partnership Agreement are apparent. If the effort succeeds, China, whose shares in the global trading system are rising fast, will be the most affected.
You're watching Dialogue. With us once again, Mr. Wang Jingzhen, Vice Chairman of the China Council for Promotion of International Trade, and Mr. Liu Baocheng, Professor from the University of International Business and Economics. Gentlemen, just now, we've got to know about this interesting transatlantic trade alliance and also investment mechanism, likely to be $5 trillion. That's a huge number. But how much challenge is really lying ahead before any agreement can be reached? Professor Liu, let's begin with you.
Well, I think now WTO as a multilateral trade mechanism was launched also by the initiatives of the United States and the EU. And now they shift from a multilateral one into a bilateral one, which shows that they are losing confidence in something bigger they have made. So that can really shun away many of those emerging economies and developing economies.
Right.
So therefore, there might be a resistance and even hostility against this from the emerging economies and developing countries.
All right.
And number two is that whether they have the same political mandate across the Atlantic, and that remains something uncertain. So the concept is good, but with the United States, being a party girl, flirting different partners from Asia, from the from Latin America, and then from Europe. So whether they are successful and whether there's real commitment. That's
I'm not sure whether the Obama administration, after the State Union address, would really like that analogy that you've given about the party girl. But Mr. Wang, from your perspective as a trade expert, what do you perceive as the biggest challenges facing the two sides before any agreement can be reached?
And as Professor Liu mentioned just now, it is a big agreement that is going to be signed, and of course it will be contribution to the further development of bilateral economic and trade cooperation. And of course, I think it is a good thing, but it still will take some time for the two sides to reach an agreement. As now you see the tariff rate of both sides is already lower, something below than the 4%. So
even below 3%.
Yeah, even below 3%, except agriculture. So in this way, the expectation from the business community is very high. If they could provide preferential more benefits to the business community, it would be approved. Otherwise, it would be difficult. And this is one. The second is, of course, you see for the price asking from the United States to the European side is mainly on the agricultural side. And we know very well that EU has subsidized each year almost $50 billion on agricultural products. And if there has been too much concessions from the EU side on the agricultural issue, and I think that is a political serious side for the governments of different countries. Then vice versa, from the European side, it will ask the United States to open more the areas such as financial area, telecommunications, infrastructures, and also you see it could be adopted by the federal government, still will be carried out by the local government. So it will be difficult for the local governments to materialize or to finalize all these aspects. So I think ultimately it will be signed. It is a question of time, and it will not be plain sailing.
Well, it is always a question of time, isn't it? Yeah. Even about the Doha round, people say it's just a matter of time, but it's been really quite a long time. To discuss more about this issue, we are also joined by Mr. Joseph Yanin, who is the Mercator Fellow from the German Council on Foreign Relations. He's now in Berlin. Mr. Yanin, welcome to our program. Talking about all of these challenges lying ahead before any agreement can be reached about this wonderful mechanism, if possible, there are also questions about its significance in politics. Some would say, Mr. Yanin, that this is likely to be a trade NATO if a mechanism can be reached. Will it, the question is, the political significance overcome all of these practical challenges facing the mechanism? Mr. Yanin.
Well, many thanks, Qianwei, for being on the show. I can say, indeed, it is of political significance. At a time when the strategic alliance, mainly manifesting in NATO, is in a way weakening, it is an attempt to politically reinforce the relationship. And it is so because the tricky issues, as has been said before, is not really the tariff issue, but is the non-tariff side in trade, in services and investments. And that has mostly to do with regulatory reform, with regulatory convergence between the two sides. And there, interestingly, there are a number of very profound differences, and it will require political determination on both sides to overcome these differences. And if they do, and when they do, it will be a signal of a reinforced, of a deepened political relationship between the United States and the European Union.
Of course, many believe at this time of economic difficulty, a mechanism, if can be reached, will be a boost, a plus for both sides. However, as both you and other panelists in our studio mentioned earlier, some of the political decisions that both sides have to make might be a minus for the political leadership in both sides. So how much possibility is there, let's say, in the next few years, this one can come into reality?
Well, the negotiations will certainly be hard. And it will take some time to actually tackle the more sensitive issues. And then in the end, ratification in Congress on the United States end is all but certain, because there are so many vested particular interests that will come to the fore when Congress has to vote on it.
And what does it mean, do you think, Mr. Yanin? Some say if an agreement can be reached for this transatlantic partnership, then certain standards will be set for other, whether regional trade agreement or bilateral trade agreements and mechanisms. Do you believe that is likely to be the case? Do you believe this one is comparable to other trade deals and negotiations going on right now?
Well, given the size of the two economies, it is something special. And I think that is part of the political intention that drives both sides. They are seeing the Doha round as not really moving forward, while at the same time free trade agreements are proliferating all around the world. So to conduct such a comprehensive agreement between the two biggest traders, both the US and the EU, are very important for each other, certainly will set standards that then will have an impact on the global trade scene. And I think exactly that is part of the political momentum of this decision, basically by President Obama, because on the European end, the EU has been ready for quite some time to explore this. It has been the Americans who were reluctant to do it. The fact that they do it now indicates that they have written off a scheme where it is the global arena that is the most important for the United States. Now, the impact of US-European agreement will be an instrument to help shape the global trade environment as well.
Joseph Yanin, Mercator Fellow from the German Council on Foreign Relations in Berlin. Be with us. We are going to talk to you later in the second half of our show. Let's come back to the studio discussion. What do you think might be the impact of this trade mechanism, even though at the time when it is under negotiation, what it might mean for standards and for levels of discussions on other negotiations going on around the world? Mr. Wang.
As we have seen, there are many negotiations on the FTA right now, and some have been effective, and some are going to be discussed, and some are going to be established. And I think it could be divided into two groups. And one group is discussed between the developing country, which mainly centering on those reduce of the tariff. And also the other group is between the developed countries, which are mainly focused on the non-tariff issue, including those such that is environmental, labor standard, and also those patent rights, those sort of issues. So I think you see, if you look at a history, and almost 20 years ago, there was a talk, or there was a suggestion for negotiate this transatlantic agreement, but ultimately it was not successful. But now the situation has been changed greatly, and it is the time for them to restart the negotiation again. And for for the Uruguay round, started in 1987, and ultimately it was failed after 4 years. Then after that, United States negotiated the North America Free Trade Agreement, which set the standards which were incorporated finally in the WTO system. So I think if you look at this situation, I'm sure that the standards that are going to be applied in the transatlantic free trade agreement will be the standard, or at least some of them will be incorporated in the multilateral trading system in the future.
But of course, once again, it's a matter of timing, isn't it? Whether an agreement can be reached and efficiently reached, and whether that will have an impact on the other negotiations. One of the negotiations many people are looking at, particularly concerning Asia, is the so-called TPP, which was initiated by the United States and, as said, also by some of its allies. However, there have been different opinions about the possibility of TPP, whether it can be reached or not, because it has not yet inviting any of the emerging economies in the Asia-Pacific region, China, for example, Indonesia, for example, and some of the others as well. Professor Liu, with the negotiations going on right now for the transatlantic partnership, and now an uncertain TPP is about its future, where will be the real inspirations coming from in terms of the standards, in terms of the level of discussions, in terms of pushing the trade systems globally one step further? are we totally in a deadlock right now?
I think now this is another signal that the world, and particularly those like the EU and the United States who launched the initiative of dealing with GATT, with WTO, they've been losing confidence in this multilateral type of arrangement. Now they resort now to more of the regional agreements, so which means that they are forsaking a bus and now start a minivan. And then for the TPP, which is very difficult to manage, I should say, but the advantage is that there is complementarity in the trading structure and also in those investment mechanisms. But for the transatlantic, it is really between two most developed economies. There is a sort of overlap in the economic and also in the industrial pattern, but that is a negotiation between cousins. So therefore, it could be easier to reach something, but not focusing on the reduction of tariff, but rather in the service area and also in the investment facilitation programs.
You see one Trans-Pacific partnership, the other is Trans-Pacific partnership, all under negotiation right now. Which one is likely to lead, rather, when it comes to the future trend? Or, rather, all of the real deals, all of the real discussions about the future are going to fall on regional trade agreements, bilateral trade agreements, and trade agreements between and among emerging economies. Mr. Wang.
And I think for the two agreements, and each one has its advantage and a disadvantage. And for the transatlantic, then I think to a certain extent, it will be much easier as the participants are all developed countries.
Right.
And they have the same standard, they have the same understandings, and they have the same rules of practices.
Right.
But for the TPP, and it involves with developed countries and the developing countries that are in the different development stage right now. So as we know that the standard for the TPP is also very high, and I really doubt whether it could be accepted by some of the members, such as some of the potential members, such as Vietnam and also some others. So I think, so at the very beginning, maybe it will be easier for them to say we can join. Then when they really enter into the heart of the agreement, then they will have a second thought. So I think each one has its advantage.
Very interesting discussion about the global trade system. Of course, we're going to continue our discussion about that, and particularly about which one is going to be, or already, the biggest trading nation in the world, and what does it mean for the world. We'll be back after this. Welcome back. You're watching a live edition of Dialogue coming to you from CCTV News. I'm Tian Wei. With me in the studio once again, we have Professor Liu Baocheng from the University of International Business and Economics based in Beijing. And also we have Mr. Wang Jingzhen, Vice Chairman of the China Council for Promotion of International Trade. Gentlemen, we've been discussing about the recent dramatic change going on in terms of negotiations and mechanism of the international trade system. But let's focus on one important issue, which is which one now is the largest trading nation? Is it the United States or China? Mr. Wang, I have to ask you about this. Recently, we noticed the Chinese Ministry of Commerce coming out and firmly correcting the statistic from the United States saying China is not yet the largest trading nation. But the question really is, does it matter?
According to the statistics from Chinese General Administration of Customs, that the total import and export of China last year was about $3.86 trillion US dollars. And according to the US side, U.S. figure is a little bit smaller than China. And of course, you see, we are going to wait the final figure from the official source, that is the WTO, by the end of this month or early next month. So I think it doesn't matter when China will be the biggest trading nation. It is a question of time. If it was not last year, then maybe it will be this year or maybe in the future. Then it won't be alone China that will take over United States as the biggest trading nations. And the U.S. will be taken over again by the other countries, such as India. Because you see, China and India each has a population of 1.3 billion people.
Right.
People means production force, and people means power of consumption. So people, both countries have a lot of people to produce for the world markets, and also are import for consuming from the other markets. So I think it is the matter of timing to rank the first or second.
Right. Is that title of any significance at all, Professor Liu?
I think yes. The nominal value is symbolic, but in the meantime, being number one is like joining a race. So you will be identified, you will be recognized better, and of course the political significance is that by the Chinese proverb, the fattest pig get butchered soonest. So therefore, you can be easily identified as an opponent. So therefore, I think for China is not afraid, because we had once been been the biggest exporter in 2009 by surpassing Germany, but we are not afraid to be number one. But now I think it is really clarification of different statistical method that is being used.
And now we're also joined once again by Joseph Yanin, Mercator Fellow from the German Council on Foreign Relations in Berlin. Mr. Yanin, one of our panelists sitting in the studio was using the analogy of the fattest pig. Whether it is the biggest one or not, China has already been facing a lot of trade protectionism, as the country believes, when it comes to its foreign trade. What do you think about this reality, and what does it mean, particularly in the future, if China ever gets that title of the biggest trading nation in the world?
Well, to be the biggest creates attention. That's the primary effect. And there are lots of people around the world asking, how is it done? What are the conditions? What's the responsibility of the biggest trading nation with regard to global trade? So to be first or second automatically means more people will be looking at you, will be looking at policies, at institutions, at practices. And also, that will be part of the blaming game. The major trading nations so far in the past, they have faced that, and China will face that too. I don't think it's an issue for concern. It just comes with size.
Once again, during those debates about whether there is protectionism or no protectionism, who is using protectionism against whom, there's always the question about what standards should be used, and also what should be a free trade system in the world be like? Will it continue to be like what it was 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago, when the Western countries were certainly the biggest trading power? That's one of the questions people ask. Mr. Yanin.
Yes, that's true. And actually, you see, when you look at the development of the European Union, the difficulties it took to move from a common market to a single market, which implies much more than just open trade and much convergence, you see what is at stake there. The more the global economy integrates, and the more Western Europe and the United States depend on growth in China, and China depends on thriving economies among its principal trading partners, the more these issues, these regulatory issues, these non-tariff issues, these issues of practices will become sensitive in part of the political game. So in fact, to relate to our earlier debate about the US-EU deal, it seems to me that as the relationship intensifies and deepens, China, willing or unwilling, will be sucked much more into those debates about regulations, rules, standards, and norms, and probably find itself in continuous dialogue with its principal partners over how far and in how fast China will join more or less such a scheme of rules.
Joseph Yanin from the German Council on Foreign Relations, thank you very much, sir. Let's come back to our studio discussion. Well, we've been talking about those debates going on right now, but the question is, Besides the Western countries and developed economies, how much can emerging economies such as China, India, and many others contribute to this debate about what should be the most important standards used now and in the future? Mr. Wang.
China became the largest exporting country in 2009 and the second largest importing country also the same year. And in fact, China has contributed greatly to the development of the world economy. And also, I think with the time passing, then China will contribute more to the recovery of the even the European crisis, and also further contribution to the improvement of the living standard. So I think at this time, you see, while China is developing, and of course, China will shoulder its own responsibilities to further contribute to the improvement of the international standard of the trading system. So that is what China has done in the past and will do in the future. So basically,
right.
China's situation of developing country hasn't been changed yet, but
right.
we'll do our best.
Well, we see the WTO now, its process Doha round being bogged down for quite some time. Regional trade agreements, even though budding, still not much being reached. Bilateral trade agreement, though, has been quite active over the past few years. The question is, once again, what can China and emerging economies contribute? Will they be able to help set the new standard, which is a very crucial process?
Now we are the largest product maker, but we have to learn to be one of the major rule makers. And in the meantime, China should take better initiative and learn the leadership role in all the regional agreements and join the global community in dialogue and by innovating not only products, technology, but ideas.
Well, certainly that is going to be a gradual process. Meanwhile, I'm sure we're going to see the different stages of negotiations going on for regional, bilateral, and global trade discussions. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Wang Jingzhen and Liu Baocheng, thank you. And thank you for joining us in Beijing. Thank you, sir.
Agreed to pursue talks aimed at achieving an overarching transatlantic free trade deal. The deal to form the world's biggest free trade alliance would promote trade between economies that account for half the world's economy and 1/3 of its trade. The 27-member EU said this would be the biggest bilateral trade agreement ever negotiated.
A future deal between the world's two most important economic powers will be a game changer. Together, we will form the largest free trade zone in the world.
President Barack Obama threw his weight behind this in his State of the Union address.
And tonight I'm announcing that we will launch talks on a comprehensive transatlantic trade and investment partnership with the European Union, because trade that is fair and free across the Atlantic supports millions.
Hello, you're watching Dialogue, coming to you live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm Tian Wei. The United States and the EU are beginning to work on one of the world's biggest free trade agreements, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. Meanwhile, the United States and China are using different accounting methods to figure out which country deserves the title of the world's biggest trading nation by volume. In addition, an increasing number of regional free trade agreements and bilateral trade deals are under negotiation or have already been reached. So how to understand the dramatic changes going on in transatlantic trade alliance and also investment mechanism? Likely to be $5 trillion. That's a huge number. But how much challenge is really lying ahead before any agreement can be reached? Professor Liu, let's begin with you.
Well, I think now WTO as a multilateral trade mechanism was launched also by the initiatives of the United States and the EU. And now they shift from a multilateral one into a bilateral one. which shows that they are losing confidence in something bigger they have made. So that can really shun away many of those emerging economies and developing economies.
Right.
So
of good-paying American jobs.
The report estimates a deal would boost Europe's economy by around 0.5%, or $116 billion, and America's by 0.4%, or nearly $90 billion in just over a decade. The US and Europe's motives for pursuing the Transatlantic Strategic Economic Partnership Agreement are apparent. If the effort succeeds, China, whose shares in the global trading system are rising fast, will be the most affected.
You're watching Dialogue. With us once again, Mr. Wang Jingzhen, Vice Chairman of the China Council for Promotion of International Trade, and Mr. Liu Baocheng, Professor from the University of International Business and Economics. Gentlemen, just now, we've got to know about this interesting international trade with the rise of emerging economies. With the current international trade system, will it last, despite of the Doha round trade talks being bogged down and falling public confidence? Joining us to answer all of these questions and predicting the future of global trade system, I'm joined here in the studio by Mr. Wang Jingzhen, who is the Vice Chairman of the China Council for Promotion for International Trade. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
And also we're joined in the studio by Professor Liu Baocheng from the University of International Business and Economics. Welcome as well. Later we're going to also talk to some of the European experts on the issue. But before we go to a discussion with both of you and many others, let's take a look at this background report.
The European Union and the United States have agreed